Hey folks, let's kick this thing off. First of all, happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to Defender Fridays. As many of you know, this is our weekly rendezvous to come together with all the best and brightest minds in defensive information security, which our guest today is definitely in that arena. Olaf Hartong joins us. It is currently 7:30 p.m. in his time zone, so thank you so much, Olaf, for jumping on with us. For anyone that doesn't know Olaf, first of all, I'd be surprised because he's just one of those names. He's instrumental in our field. He's definitely on the cutting edge of many things in defensive detection engineering and security research. Currently, he's working with the FalconForce team, and he specializes in understanding attacker tradecraft in order to improve detection. So, thanks again for joining us, Olaf. I know anytime that I've had the chance to talk with you, it's always been just wildly insightful. You're always working on something new, something interesting. And I know just prior to us starting the call here officially, we were just going back and forth about one of those interesting topics, which is, for instance, when organizations are seeking to improve their coverage detection mapping, meaning like how can I have like a picture basically of what detections do we have if we're looking at MITRE attack? What can we detect and what can we not? And we're just talking about like how hard that is to do well. I mean, you can slap something together that kind of tells that story, but when you really start pulling at it, you're like, wait a minute, but that's not really the full picture. And like it's a tricky thing to do. But Olaf, welcome to Defender Fridays, and I'm super excited to chat with you today about whatever's on
Yeah,
your
thanks
mind.
for the invite again, man. It's and too much credit on the intro, but I appreciate it. It's very humbling. Yeah, and that I still struggle with like the vision. I'm a very visually oriented guy, so every time a client asks me, "Is like, hey, can you grade our like detection capability?" First the thing is just like, "Hey, do you tag with attack?" Because that's sort of the industry standard right now. It's not perfect, but it's probably the best we got, and it's pretty decent. So usually I start there. And then if you're lucky, they actually do some tagging. And one of the clients I was working with today, I was telling you earlier, but they basically tagged only on the technique level. So we've had sub techniques for a couple of years, which makes it a little bit easier sometimes. But there's also tactics, and some techniques span multiple tactics and these kind of things, and they didn't really do that. So it's a very troubled picture, but at least there is some visibility, right? So at least they know where to focus on, which is also important to them. But then it's also difficult to see how good is that coverage. I mean, you have coverage, but how decent is it? So one of the things I now do or try to do is at least is like a stupid count. So if you have 10 detections,
Yeah,
you have you have potentially more coverage than one, but
that's right.
that
That's
doesn't
right.
necessarily mean it's better, right? So you can have one really good detection for DC sync and 10 detections for PowerShell that you mentioned earlier. I'll probably have more trust in the DC sync one. So one way I'm still struggling with is to also visualize confidence. Um, I don't know how to do that yet. I can grade it and I can use it in my YAMLs and use it when I build my rules and put it in there for risk calculations and everything. But visualizing trust is that's a thing that I haven't tackled yet. So anybody that has suggestions, I'm very open to suggestions there.
Yeah, I actually want to take a second here because there might be folks that this is a very new concept for, and I don't want to speak over the heads of anybody on kind of this idea of using metadata in your detection rules in order to start to make your way towards the sophistication of being able to generate coverage maps. So I'm bringing up a couple of examples because I think this will really illustrate it very nicely. Let me do a quick screen share real quick because I want to be able to kind of put a visual aid to kind of what Olaf's talking about. So like when he talks about let me see, is my screen coming through here?
Yep.
Can you
Yeah,
see
yeah.
the
You're sharing
Sigma
signal.
project? Awesome. So when Olaf talks about like metadata, the attack metadata inside of a detection rule, this is something that you'll often see done in like the popular rule sets like Sigma here. You notice how they have the tags set for this rule, and in the tags are some like MITRE attack, either tactic IDs or technique IDs, and so on and so forth. And this is a really solid sort of approach to take because Once you're starting to do this, you're putting that metadata inside your detection rules from the start. It gets you closer to the ability to generate this, but with actual mappings, right? Because you can kind of programmatically extract that metadata from your detection rules and then generate these JSON kind of mapping layers that apply over the attack navigator and will kind of highlight and color code the techniques that you have coverage for. But see, whereas as Olaf was just saying, where that gets tricky is you can't just say, well, okay, we have a signature for scheduled task creation. Therefore, we have that technique covered. It's like, but there's like 12 different ways to create a scheduled task, right? So you have one of those covered, but that doesn't mean you have total coverage over that technique, right? Is that kind of, does that resonate, Olaf?
Yeah, totally. That's exactly what I was going for. And the cool thing I like about that navigator is that you can also layer per like tool sets that you have. Like you have a SIM, you have an EDR, you have all these other things. And what I like to do, because I tend to over-engineer stuff, is to get layers for each individual product, right? So I know what my EDR can cover. And one of my clients uses Elastic, so they're actually pretty cool that they just share whatever they have. Like their full detection repository is on GitHub for their EDR. So you can profile that and make a layer of it, and you can actually see what it's not catching. So you can actually build your own detection rules on top of that, or use Sigma or other products
But you know what's
to
funny?
augment that.
What's funny about that though is that while this is like a really awesome effort to go through, add the metadata, build the coverage maps, in some cases it actually stings a little bit, even if you do it right and you do it well, because there's no such thing as 100% coverage, right?
No,
And but your CISO never, your CISO and other decision makers, like they don't want to see a lack of 100% coverage because they think it's possible. They look at your coverage map and they say, all I see is the stuff that we're missing. And while yes, that should inform what we focus on next, there's still no such thing as 100%, right? And so that gets a little bit tricky, Olaf, I would imagine.
yeah, usually you can have a good conversation with them. You can
Yeah.
explain it to them, but not always. You can probably cheat a bit because you can also hide stuff on that graph, right? So if you really want to, if you really want to go that way, that's also an opportunity. But usually it's a good point to open up the discussion with those stakeholders and ask them how they want to be informed, right? Maybe that's not the right way to show it.
Right.
And maybe you should talk in the risk factor, and then you can explain them. So yeah, those gaps, some of them are not a risk to us because we don't use that technology or that kind of stuff. And then also you become across as more knowledgeable to that person, so they trust you more for the next iteration, these kind of things. So it depends a little bit, and it might also help if you're starting with those coverage maps, not to use the red, orange, yellow, and green kind of colors, which we tend to use a lot in the industry, but that also they're also trained to read that and read into that, right? So if you say green, then you're done. It's good. Um, but
What you're saying
we
is
know we're never done.
I should only use shades of green. There's
Well,
there's
maybe, yeah.
there's dark green through light green. What's light green mean? Oh, we barely have any detection for that at all.
Yeah,
But it's
exactly.
light green, so nobody cared.
At least we have something. But
Yeah.
that's yeah. I tend to use blue, but that's because it's sort of neutral. But we can also use purple or whatever. It doesn't really matter. But I
Sure.
tend to steer away for those traffic light signal colors because then people have like a connotation with it already.
So I've got a question for you, Olaf. So if you're sitting down with an organization to help them assess their coverage mapping, kind of like what we're talking about now, what different data sources do you generally pull from? We already talked about one being, say, give me all your detection rules, right? Because I can hopefully extract the metadata from the detection rules, or like you mentioned, worst case, I can look through the titles of the rules, which is not great because I don't know what they're doing. But if the titles are very accurate and descript, maybe that helps. But what other data sources would you need to pull from in order to put together a coverage mapping like this?
That's almost everything, right? Even their
Yeah,
mitigation, you should start mapping because those are
right,
equally important. Um, and then you can go as far as, well, yeah, we talked about the EDR. The SIM is usually a data source that can be very useful if they have detections on that, but also just telemetry could be useful. If you know what kind of telemetry there is, you could use the data source components even to visualize what they
right.
technically could be covering, right? That's all potentially because then it has to be complete and well ingested everything, but
I think
there's a potential there.
that's a critical point you just made, right? A critical point you just made is even if I have detection rules for all the bad things that have ever been bad, if my data sources are not up to snuff, meaning I'm not even shipping the correct telemetry for that rule to ever fire, then it doesn't matter, right? So you made a really critical point there, is that it has to include everything because there's dependencies here. You might have a detection rule, but if you're not shipping that data source, it didn't matter that you had the rule in the first place.
No, or the other way around. I have
Yeah.
several clients that ingest like their full landscape of firewalls into their usually SIM or data analysis platform, and they have like one rule on it, and they're storing like terabytes of data in Splunk or in
Uh,
Sentinel or whichever platform it is. It's like a huge
and
cost for them,
and
and
you
it's not utilized at all. It's like a huge waste. So either get away with it or build some proper rules and store it elsewhere, by God's sake. But
and you know what the one rule is? It's check for our volume limit to be exceeded where our SIEM license is going to go crazy.
usually, yeah, yeah. But they're paying through the nose to store that stuff, and
Right,
it's like just noise. I'd rather have a proxy log than a firewall log in most cases because it's telling me more information than
right.
only this IP talk to that over this port. Right? And then if you have a better firewall, you might see a bit more, but still, it's mostly useless.
Well, here's a question for you. So, you might have folks on this call right now that are kind of thinking about this now, and they're thinking, "Wow, okay, I've never even begun to map my organization's detection coverage against MITRE ATT&CK. It sounds like a good idea, but let's say I get started in doing that, and I find out I have very little coverage, and that's okay. We all start somewhere. But I guess
Sure.
how would you advise a practitioner and a security team? How would you advise them to prioritize, right? If I'm looking at that big giant matrix with its hundreds of techniques, like how do I know where to start? Where should I start improving my detection capability if I'm trying to fill out that coverage map?
There's many answers, and I don't agree with any of them because it's a huge consultancy answer of it depends.
Yeah,
I think, I mean, if you have a threat intelligence capability in your company, definitely talk to them
yeah,
because they are already investigating who might be targeting you. Um, Not necessarily that's always true because they usually rely on whatever on the internet, which is also full of not always accurate information, as we all know. So, but it's a start, right? So you could at least focus on that. That's one thing. Another thing is where are you comfortable with, and where can you quickly build stuff? Because if you're already really good at network or whichever log source, it's more likely that you can churn out qualitative detections on that end. If it's also likely that that will be used in your organization. And it also has to make sense, right? I can build 20 rules for AWS, but if I have everything self-hosted, it doesn't really make sense to
that's
focus
right.
on that bit for that single EC2 instance that we have. So it also has to, probably you want to do big steps first, right? So the simple detections that cover a lot and then grow from there, because that also gives you some more hands-on experience, so you get more familiar with building detections and analyzing how to properly do this. And of course, there's all kinds of stuff online, right? You just search
Yeah,
Sigma. There's way more of those projects. Look at those rules and then don't necessarily copy paste them because that usually doesn't work.
right.
But use that as a base layer to then start involving or improving it and implementing it in your information in your environment.
I think that's a pretty fantastic combination of answers, and I want to kind of recap that for folks. So essentially, the two sort of considerations. Well, if I was to summarize the two major ones, it's use a threat intelligence informed approach, right? Like, so don't just start swinging blindly and writing rules that maybe are not as important for your organization. Well, the way he mentioned it was, if you have a threat intelligence team, maybe go consult with those folks. And if you do, then that's the absolute right answer. But a lot of orgs do not have dedicated threat intelligence teams. So let me give you kind of the midway approach there, right? If I don't have dedicated threat intelligence, it's still, I think, a worthwhile activity to try to sketch out sort of like a threat model for your organization. And it's a generally fairly straightforward thing to do, right? You identify your own industry. You know, okay, well, I work in finance, I work in healthcare, I work in, critical infrastructure, and then a little bit of research goes a long way to find out, well, what threat actors generally go after my industry. Okay, now that I have identified those top three threat actors, what are their favorite tactics and techniques, right? And then that can generally inform, right? So you're doing a little bit of threat intel yourself, which is a sizable lift in the beginning, but once you kind of sketch that thing out, that can inform future detection engineering activities for years to come. But it's something you want to revisit and keep up to date, right? But then the other thing he said, I'm a huge fan of, is go after the quick wins, right? Like, don't spend weeks trying to master this, whatever detection when you could cram out many detections in that same period of time for lower hanging fruit and build up to the more complex and more sort of nuanced sort of detections. Does that summarize that well, Olaf?
Yeah, totally. And even some of the rules I still write are just, they look very silly, but they work, right? So why not? And then you can focus. Sometimes you have to do some sophisticated ones for sure, because otherwise you get flooded by noise and alerts, and you never get to anything else. But yeah, why not? So keep it simple if you can, and use the knowledge that you have, right? So you know your environment way better than any attacker will when he lands. Maybe later he might know it better because they are very good at understanding companies, how they look and how they operate. But you know what is most delicate in your environment. So protect that maybe a little bit more than some random other server. So you also know where to focus. And there's all these tools out there, right? So still Bloodhound, that's my favorite tool for years. It's a red team tool by design, like by initiation. And now there's a commercial blue version for it. But it's super useful to understand like your Active Directory infrastructure, your Azure infrastructure. There's no AWS coverage for it yet, but at some point somebody will release that too. Just to understand what an attacker could be achieving that you can't directly see, with, like or from the directory itself.
Yeah. So anybody that's not familiar with
Yeah,
Blood.
or Ping Castle, indeed. Yeah,
Oh
sorry.
yeah, Pink Castle's a good one too. But both of these tools tend to do, but Bloodhound has a very specific approach to doing it. Is
Yeah.
it will effectively enumerate in mass an entire Active Directory environment, for instance, and it will draw a map for an adversary of the shortest, fastest path to domain admin, right? And it does this just by enumerating where all the various different logon sessions are, where all the credentials are cached on various different endpoints, and then basically connecting the dots. You are currently here, you want to get here, well, here's a logical path that you could follow. So there's obvious reason an adversary would love to do that, right? But now envision why you as a defender might enjoy understanding that path as well, right? If I were to drop onto an accounting system in my company, right, just maybe take a newly imaged laptop that would be in the accounting subnet and the accounting, AD groups, and then run Bloodhound from that system and find out all of the skeletons in the closet of 10, 20 years of IT, where, oh, because there's this service account running on this machine with privileges, and this, et cetera, privilege escalation, I could get local admin, then I could eventually work my way up to domain admin. And these things are unknown until you observe them, right? And so, yeah, Bloodhound is a fantastic tool. Ping Castle, as Newman called out, is another really awesome tool that gets some cool AD kind of security assessments done. And I think that one is free, right? For kind of like,
For internal
one-off
use, it's free. Yeah.
internal usage. Yeah, which is fantastic. You gotta love a model like that, you know.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's so useful, and a lot of that information is very hard to just look up by hand. So it's great that people spend the time to really build these tools and even maintain them really well. So it's
No doubt. No doubt. Well, Olaf, you were working on is it Sharphound that you work on?
well,
Uh,
we also work on that, but that's more for the red side. We're
that's right.
working on FalconHound. That's the other tool that we
Falcon.
created, and that's basically trying to help you automate a lot of the Bloodhound work for you. So basically, how Bloodhound works is that you need to run SharpHound or Azure Hound
Right.
in your environment that basically talks to AD and all the systems in your environment to get like logon sessions and all that other stuff out. But scanning across multiple firewalls, multiple zones is usually tricky, and the machines have to be on, right? So if I
Right.
scan now in Europe, it's evening. Most people are enjoying the weekend already. So a lot of machines won't be online. And as defenders, we don't really need to because it's in the logs. We can see when people log on and when they log off and way more things. So I built a tool that gets that from multiple logging platforms and then shoots it up into the Neo4j database that's behind Bloodhound. And we'll also do these paths that you were talking about, like calculate them every time I run it and shoot that back as a log entry so I can alert on it.
Okay, okay, all right. You're blowing my mind right now because full disclosure, I have not looked into Falcon Hound until right now. If I understand what you've built here, you're allowing basically passive collection of the same data that I would get with SharpHound, which SharpHound, for anyone unfamiliar, is like an exe you run inside the environment, and it does that very active gathering of information. But you're saying what Falcon Hound allows me to do is gather that same data passively from nothing more than log data.
Well, and more, right? So
Wow.
that log on sessions is nice because you
Yeah.
can see like who's logged on where.
Right.
I extended it with also logged off. So if you're not on the machine anymore, but you were yesterday, it's likely that you might be back today or tomorrow, right? So I still want to know that path. So I also have an edge for that, but I can also track alerts. So if you have an alert on your user and on your machine, your user and your machine will also be flagged as compromised. So I can also track lateral movement that way. So if your machine is compromised and then the accounting machine is compromised and they are both in that path to a sensitive resource, I can actually see the attacker moving laterally. So I can also predict where he's going next. So that's even cooler. If you're quick, right? And I run this every
Yeah.
15 minutes.
Yeah.
And at a very large org, that becomes a tricky thing because if you sync like thousands of sessions every couple of minutes, Neo4j becomes a little bit slow. But
Sure.
in most environments I tested it, it works amazing. And most EDRs also do vulnerability scanning, so I can do the same there, right? So I can see, hey, this machine has a CVE
Yes.
and it has a path to something sensitive. So we need to patch that one sooner than the other one that's laying behind some firewall and far away and is not a risk to anybody, right? So it can also help you prioritize patch management and all kinds of stuff. The possibilities are endless. It's quite fun. And it's relatively easy once you have that like data stream going back and forth.
That is phenomenal, man. I'm like ashamed that I'm only just now learning about this project.
Yeah, it's
Um,
super new, right? It's
yeah,
I released it end of last year, so it's not strange that you didn't know about it.
that is way cool. Way cool. So right now, the data sources that it supports, it looks like Azure Sentinel, Splunk, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, Neo4j, Graph API, and in raw CSVs. Um,
Yeah, I'm
any
working on
plans
the
for
Lima Charlie integration actually.
yes.
So I got an account. I can query already. I can't write back yet. So that's one of the things I still need to figure out. And I'm also working on an Elastic integration. So I try to cover most of the big platforms. And then I hope the community will help me. I built a lot of actions for the Microsoft stack because that's where most of
Yeah,
my clients are.
right.
But I mean, if you look at the queries I do, they're not super difficult to port to the platform you are familiar with, right? So that's hopefully at some point there will be a community forming that actually starts using this as well and helps me a little bit with all the transformations because I can try. I'm pretty proficient at Splunk, but Elastic not so much, and they keep on changing their query language, so I'm not sure which one I should use. But there's probably a lot of people in the community that love it and use it on a daily basis, so they would be way better equipped to actually do that.
That's fantastic. I really dig it. That's super cool, man. Well, we've got a couple more minutes, Olaf. I'd love to hear if there's any other cool things you've got working on or interesting things that you've seen here recently, or any other parting insights for our defensive-minded audience.
Man, That's
I know
another
that's like,
one.
I know that's
Yeah, it's
it's
like
pretty much
everything.
just reach up and grab something. I mean, any emerging threats that you guys are seeing over at Falcon Force? Anything interesting you guys are trailing?
Well, I've been digging deep on all the enterprise management tooling. So SCCM has had a lot of scrutiny already. So I've been looking into like Intune and some of the live response capabilities of
Mm.
EDRs. And and there's a lot of attack surface there if you get to an account with the right properties, right? And sadly, most of those tooling or most of that tooling doesn't really have sufficient logging, so you can't really track them really well. That's still something I'm working with some of those vendors with, which is a very nice insight, but it's good to be aware of, I guess. So protect those users as if they are domain administrators, because it's
No doubt.
usually there is a direct path from there for sure, and they're less well protected. So
100%, right? Like, there's organizations that have the what are they called? The RMM tools like, Case and Bomgar or similar to SGCM.
yep,
And you got these platforms either sitting on-prem or even worse, exposed up in the cloud with less privilege or less, RBAC or, MFA or otherwise authentication safeguards, then you would say, okay, our domain controllers are hardened, right? Our domain controllers are super secure. But this tool that has an agent on every system in the environment, including the domain controllers, is less secure.
yep,
That's now the shortest path to victory, right? For an adversary. So what was it? I think it was WebRoot some years back, was part of a pretty big ransomware campaign where it was unauthorized access to the webroot console, and I hope I'm not misremembering it being webroot, but yeah, unauthorized access to the webroot console gave basically command and control on many downstream endpoints, and then they were using that to propagate ransomware. But the same thing can happen with all these other tools, Kaseya, info, or the various different RMM tools that basically are C2 shells, and EDR. EDR is the same, right? We know this as well.
yep.
So yeah, how many safeguards do you apply against those platforms is something that organizations really got to think about.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. We even had a client where they didn't have like that live response feature enabled. So because they were scared of this whole problem.
Oh, that
But
always that
the
always
attacker managed to gain enough privilege to assign himself the
to turn it on.
privilege to enabled it. There was no logging for it, and they went to town, right? It's crazy.
The irony, it always stings a little bit when I talk to teams that have basically disabled powerful features, like for instance, PowerShell remoting, right? I've heard from teams that their IT just shut down PowerShell remoting, and I asked the question like why, and they're like, well, because attackers can use it. I'm like, okay, I'm with you there. Attackers can use it. However, it's also one of your most powerful tools in an IR, right? And it's one of your most secure tools for remote administration of endpoints. So why would you take away a very powerful tool instead of just getting a better understanding of it, getting solid detections around it? Because another way to think about it is, hey, let's write a detection for anyone using PowerShell remoting that's not in this AD group or coming from this subnet, right? Like turn it into a strength instead of taking the strength away from everyone, right? And yeah, I
Yep.
mean, it seems like that'd be the same thing. You take away the EDR console from your defenders, yet an attacker might still work their way to it anyway. All you've done is hurt your own defense. And yeah, it's kind of a,
Yeah, some of those PowerShell things you can partially mitigate other ways as well. Right?
yeah,
You can have like directionality, so you can't use it from endpoints to servers, but you can use it from specific subnets towards the whole organization. That's the same with like Samba or all these other protocols that can be definitely abused, but they're also extremely useful and
yeah.
can be used in a safe way properly as well.
No doubt, no doubt. Well, hey, folks, that brings us to the top of the hour. Super fun conversation today, Olaf. Really appreciate you jumping on with us, especially with it being nearly, what, 8 p.m. for you. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Have an amazing Friday. We'll see you all next week. Next week's guest is still to be determined. We've got a couple possibilities, though. We'll post out on socials when we know for sure. As you already know, be sure to join us in our community Slack. You can get there at slack.limacharlie.io. There's a channel specifically called Defender Fridays where you can keep the conversation going between Fridays, and that's generally where we like to drop the links that we put in chat here, so that if you miss the links in chat, you can grab them in Slack. Otherwise, have a fantastic weekend, and we'll see you all same time, same place next week. Take care, folks.
Take care, guys.